Welcome back, everybody, to the deep dive. This time, we're going to jump into the world of CAR T-cell therapy.
Oh, wow.
It's moving so fast.
Yeah.
And
Hard to.
we found this press release from a company called CellFE, and they're launching something called the T-Rest kit. And this could be a big deal.
It really could be. Yeah, they're working on a completely new way to make these CAR T cells, and the potential benefits are really exciting, especially when you think about the safety and how effective it could be.
So just to remind everybody very quickly, CAR T therapy uses a patient's own T cells, right?
Yeah.
And they're genetically modified
Yeah.
to attack cancer cells.
Yeah, exactly. It's like you're training their immune system to become this really focused weapon
Right.
against cancer.
So where does this T-rest kit come in? The press release talks about resting T cells.
Yeah.
And I thought the typical process was to activate and expand the T cells before you modify them.
That's the way it's traditionally done, yeah.
Yeah.
But CellFE is doing something different. They're going after T cells that are resting, which is a pretty new idea in this field.
Okay, so why is that such a big deal? Why use resting T cells? What advantages do they have?
Well, one of the biggest problems with the way CAR-T is done now is that it doesn't always last. The engineered T cells can get tired and die off, and that limits how well it works.
Yeah, makes sense. I mean, fighting cancer's got to be hard work, right? So are you saying that resting T cells are somehow better at this for the long run?
Yeah, potentially they are. Resting T cells have a higher proportion of stem cell memory T cells, and these are the cells that are really good at renewing themselves and staying alive in the body for longer. Think of them like reinforcements. They're ready to jump in and keep fighting when the other T cells are getting worn down.
So if they start with these resting T cells, CellFE is hoping to make CAR T therapies that last longer and protect patients for a longer time.
Exactly. And if they stay in the body longer, that means the treatment could be more effective and the outcomes could be better.
Yeah, that's a big potential benefit. But the press release also talks about safety. How are resting T cells safer?
That's another big plus with this approach. When you modify cells that are actively dividing, you have a higher chance of messing things up, like introducing errors or abnormalities in the chromosomes. That's because the DNA is kind of vulnerable when the cell is dividing.
So if you modify resting T cells, it's a safer way to make sure the genetic edits are accurate.
Exactly. Resting T cells aren't dividing, so they're more stable and they're less likely to have those risky genetic errors.
Okay, this is all starting to make sense, but how does CellFE actually do this? How do they modify these resting T cells? They mentioned something called a microfluidics platform. What is that?
So their Infinity MTX platform, it uses microfluidics to deliver the genetic material into the cells. It's a really precise method, and it's gentle on the cells, a lot less harsh than some of the ways it's been done before.
So instead of using these rough methods that can hurt the cells, they have this really cool high-tech system to kind of slip those modifications in.
You got it. And because it's gentler, it's probably one of the reasons why they're seeing this improved safety with their resting T cell method.
That sounds great, but I always want to see the data. Did CellFE release any findings to support all these claims about resting T cells?
Oh, they did. They put out an application note with data from their resting T cell workflow, and it's really interesting.
Okay, data time. What were the big results? What do they actually look at in these experiments?
Well, one of the key things they were looking at was how many of those stem cell memory T cells were present in the engineered cells. And what they found was, even after they modified them, the resting T cells still had a much higher proportion of those really important stem cell memory T cells compared to CAR T cells made using the traditional way.
Wow, that's pretty impressive. So it seems like they're really able to keep that stem cell memory, which is so important for long-lasting CAR T therapy.
It's a good sign, and it shows that CellFE's approach could lead to CAR T therapies that are not only safer, but could last much longer.
This is getting me excited, but of course it's still early. What other research do we need to do to make sure this really works and understand how big this could be?
You're right, this is just the first step. We need to see how well it works in preclinical studies, and then eventually in clinical trials with patients.
Of course, rigorous testing is crucial, especially with these new medical technologies. But so far, it looks really good.
I agree. The benefits of using resting T cells for CAR-T could be huge, and if it keeps showing promise, it could really change the way we treat cancer.
It's really amazing to think about the possibilities, but let's step back for a second and think bigger. If this T-rest kit from CellFE really does what it seems to, how could it change the whole field of CAR-T therapy? And maybe even beyond that.
That's a great question. This isn't just a small improvement. This could be a total shift in how we think about and develop therapies that use cells.
All right, I'm ready. Let's take a trip to the future of medicine. Where do we start?
So let's dive into that data. The application note, the one CellFE put out with the TRES announcement, it gives us a look at how this thing actually performs.
I'm all ears. What exactly were they looking at in these experiments? Did they actually make working tier T cells using this new method?
Yeah, they did. They wanted to test the whole process, from collecting those resting T cells all the way to editing them to express a CRR and then seeing how those cells worked.
Okay, can you break that down a bit for our listeners? I'm not sure everyone's up to speed on all the steps in CRT cell engineering.
Sure. So they started with resting T cells from a donor and then used the T-REST kit to get those cells ready for the genetic modification.
Hmm.
Then they used their Infinity MTXU platform to deliver a gene, the one that encodes for a specific CRR, right into those resting T cells.
Okay, so the T-RES kit is like the prep work, getting the resting T cells ready for their genetic makeover, and then the microfluidics platform actually inserts the CRR gene.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it.
Hmm.
And don't forget that CR gene is what lets the engineered T cells recognize and attack the cancer cells.
Right, it's like giving them a targeting system so they can zero in on the cancer cells and not touch the healthy ones.
Exactly. And to see how well this new method worked, they compared their CAR T cells, the ones they made from the resting T cells, to CAR T cells made the old way using the activated T cells.
Ah, the head-to-head. Now it gets interesting. What happened? Did the resting T cell approach work?
The results were pretty impressive. The CAR T cells they made from resting T cells, they actually had a few advantages over the ones made the traditional way.
Okay, spill the beans. What kind of advantages?
Well, first off, they saw that the resting T cells had what's called better transduction efficiency. Basically, that means that more of the resting T cells actually took up the CIR gene compared to the activated T cells.
Hmm. Interesting. So the resting T cells were better at taking in the genetic modification. Why would that be?
That's a good question. We don't know for sure yet, but it could be because resting T cells are in a more quiet state. They aren't dividing, so their DNA might be more accessible or more receptive to the changes.
I see. It's like they're more willing to change because they're not busy making copies of themselves.
Exactly. And the other big finding, the one we talked about earlier, is that even after the modifications, those resting T cells, they still had a lot more of those stem cell memory T cells compared to the group where they used activated T cells.
That's a big one. We've been talking about how important that stem cell memory is if you want CAR T therapy to last. And this data shows that CellFE's method can actually preserve that, which is pretty cool.
It's definitely encouraging. And it supports the idea that these here are T cells made from resting T cells. They might be able to stay in the body longer and offer better protection against the cancer coming back.
This is painting a pretty good picture so far.
Mhm.
But of course, this is early data. What else do we need to do to be sure about all this and really get a handle on how big this could be?
You're right. This application note is just the beginning. We need to see what happens in preclinical studies and then, of course, in clinical trials with actual patients.
Right, rigorous testing is so important, especially when we're dealing with new medical tech. But based on what we've seen so far, it's looking good.
I agree. Using resting T cells for CAR T therapy could have some major benefits. If this keeps looking promising, it really could change how we approach cancer treatment.
It's exciting to think about all the possibilities, but for now, let's change gears a bit. Let's talk about what this technology means for the bigger picture. What does this mean for the future of CAR therapy? And maybe even beyond that.
That's a great question, and it's taking us into some interesting territory. We're not just talking about small tweaks here. This could be a completely new way of thinking about cell-based therapies, how we make them, and how we use them.
All right, let's get into it. Let's talk about the future of medicine. What should we start with? Okay, so CellFE's technology could make CAR T therapy safer and more effective, and more people could get it.
Right.
But what does all this mean for cell therapy in general? I mean, are there other areas where this approach with the resting cells could be used?
Yeah, definitely. I think we're just starting to realize how useful resting cells could be for therapies. This idea of engineering resting cells instead of the activated ones, it could be used for other immune cells too, not just T cells.
Oh, like what? What other cells are we talking about?
Well, you've got natural killer cells, macrophages, just to name a couple. These cells are super important in our immune system, and if we can engineer them to go after specific diseases, that opens up a whole new world of treatments.
So we could see a whole new wave of cell therapies coming out, designed to target all sorts of conditions.
Exactly. And not just cancer. Think about using these engineered immune cells to treat autoimmune diseases, infections, even genetic disorders. It could be huge.
It sounds kind of sci-fi, But the way things are moving, it feels like sci-fi is becoming reality pretty fast.
It really is. And what's even more amazing is that we're not just swapping out one drug for another. We're talking about using the power of our own cells to fight disease.
That's a whole new way of thinking about healthcare. Instead of just treating the symptoms, we're trying to reprogram our bodies to heal themselves at the cellular level.
You got it. And that opens up so many possibilities. Imagine a future where we don't just manage chronic diseases, we actually cure them by basically re-engineering our cells.
That's a pretty big idea. But with all these breakthroughs in cell engineering and these new delivery techniques, it's starting to feel possible.
Yeah, and CellFE's microfluidics platform, the one they use to modify the resting T cells, that has a lot of potential too.
Oh, right. We haven't talked much about that. Beyond cell therapy, what else could we use this technology for?
Well, microfluidics lets us manipulate fluids and particles on a really tiny scale, like super precise.
Hmm.
And that level of precision could be huge in a bunch of different areas, like drug discovery and diagnostics, regenerative medicine, even personalized medicine.
Personalized medicine is a big deal these days. How could microfluidics play a part in that?
Think about drug screening, for example. With microfluidics, we could make these tiny personalized labs, almost like a lab on a chip,
Wow.
that could quickly test how different drugs interact with a specific person's cells.
So you could figure out the best treatment for each individual patient, and you could get the best results with the fewest side effects.
Exactly. Instead of a one-size-fits-all approach to medicine, we could have treatments that are designed specifically for each person's unique biology.
Wow, that would be a revolution in how we diagnose and treat and prevent diseases.
Absolutely.
This conversation has been amazing. Cell engineering and microfluidics, they have so much potential, but we need to be careful too, right? There are ethical and societal issues that we can't ignore,
Oh, for sure. We have to make sure these technologies are developed and used responsibly. We need to think about the risks and make sure we don't create unintended consequences.
like making sure everyone has access to these therapies, right?
Mm.
We don't want a future where only rich people can get these life-saving treatments.
Yeah, that's really important. And we also need to think about how this could change the way we understand disease and even how we think about our own bodies. When we can manipulate our cells so precisely, what does it even mean to be human?
Those are some deep questions. We need to have these conversations as we enter this new era of bioengineering. Scientific progress is great, but we need to think carefully and ethically about it too.
You're right. We need to be open and honest, talk about the benefits and the risks of these technologies, and involve everyone in the conversation: scientists, policymakers, ethicists, the public.
Well said. It's clear that this TRS kit from CellFE is just the start of something much bigger. Cell therapy is changing so fast, it'll be fascinating to see where it goes next.
Absolutely. We're seeing a new era in medicine, and the possibilities are pretty much endless.
It's exciting and humbling to be alive at a time like this. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into CAR T cell therapy.
Wow, what a ride. We covered a lot, from CellFE's new tech to the future of cell therapy and microfluidics,
I hope our listeners are feeling inspired by all the amazing things happening in medicine.
and maybe a little bit more in awe of how incredible the human body is.
That's a great way to put it. As we wrap up, here's a question for you to think about. As these technologies keep getting better, what role do you see yourself playing in the future of healthcare? It's something to consider as we explore this new frontier. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. We'll see you next time.